So a number of people have requested that I do another workshop tour video, but not much has changed in the workshop since I did the last one 2 years ago. So in this one, I'll focus more on some specific machines and just explain how I use them. So here we've got my main area, and this is sort of like your kitchen workspace. And much like you have this sort of kitchen triangle idea where you want a certain amount of distance that should be not too much and not too little between your fridge, your stove, and your sink. To me, the triangle is the table saw, the bandsaw, and the drill press, and of course the workbench, which would be like your counter space. So this drill press, it's actually a pretty cheap one from Canadian Tire. Sometimes people ask me, what are the specs for it and whatnot. I don't know, it's not a very good one, maybe 1/3 horsepower. I don't even have a drill press table on it. I actually find that sort of thing very awkward because I end up moving this table up and down a lot. So I wouldn't really want anything to get in the way. And for a backing, I just use a piece of wood and I just drill holes in that, and when it gets too many holes in it, I flip it over, except I've got holes in this side already. And it's important to me that I can swing this table out of the way because sometimes I need to work on the edge of something long, so I'll swing it off to the side so I get more support that way, and sometimes I even have to drill right off the edge for complicated work pieces. So no drill press table for me. You won't see an article on a drill press table for me. Next we have the bandsaw, and of course I really like this bandsaw because it's one that I built. The coolest feature about that one that's not available on commercial ones is that the dust all falls inside, so it doesn't make a mess, and I don't have to spin up the dust collector every time because that tends to take about 5 seconds before it spins up. Cool feature about that is I have a sawdust drawer, so if I need to clean up some glue squeeze out, I always have bandsaw sawdust in this drawer, and it's continuously resupplied. Next we have the table saw. This is a Delta hybrid table saw, so it looks like a nice cabinet maker saw, but it's actually built underneath more like a contractor saw. The only difference is the motor's on the inside instead of out the back, and that means the dust falls into the saw, which is very nice. But quality-wise, it's about the quality of the contractor saw. I've had to do a little bit of tweaking to this one, but now it cuts to my satisfaction, and it was much easier to get down here than a cabinet maker saw. I use the table saw with a table saw sled almost exclusively. I hardly ever use the miter gauge unless I need to cut a miter. So I use that for all cross cuts, and that sort of serves as my sliding table. Sometimes people ask about building sliding tables and such. I don't think I'll ever build one because this solution works really well. I've put like 10-foot long pieces of lumber on this sled, and because I've got a really long cold rolled steel runner on here, it's quite sturdy. So that works for larger work pieces. If I need to do work on more intricate work pieces, I'll take the sled out of the way. And I have another sled. This one is more like a typical table saw sled that people make. And this is for small parts. It supports on both sides. I don't need to make this very large because if I have large work pieces, I can just use those on my other sled. And I use that sled quite a lot. It's very handy. Okay, now moving to the back of the shop where I have machines that I don't use quite as often. So back here I've got my scroll saw, which is actually a pretty decent one. It's variable speed. I bought it at a yard sale. I hardly ever use it. Sometimes people ask me, are you ever going to build a scroll saw? I've already got one and I only use it if I absolutely have to, so no, scroll saws are not my thing, and I'm not planning on building one. It's standing on top of my lathe, which I use that a few times a year. Most of the time it serves as a stand for machines that I don't use very much, like the scroll saw and an extra little drill press. Here we have the belt sander, and that I actually use quite a lot just for sanding things flat. I don't really have much of a disc sander, just a little thing on here. So anytime I need to flatten something, I use this, or maybe the table here. And I don't have a spindle sander, so any curve I need to sand, I'll use this part, which has got the rubber backing with the roller. So that sander I use a fair bit. I have an opening for my dust extractor, and to let air in there, I just pull this container out of the hole. So very sophisticated valve on there. Then we have a little strip sander. I bought this because I got it really cheap. It cost me less than $50 new, surprisingly. And It's got a disc sander on there, which I have never actually used, but the strip sander part is extremely handy for basically smoothing the faces of gears. That's what I bought it for, and it's the perfect tool for that job. Next, I've got my jointers. So I've got my 6-inch Powermatic jointer that I bought more than 10 years ago, and I still really like this machine because it's quite quiet. And then we have my homemade jointer, which is much more capable in terms of handling really wide cuts. It also has a really long bed, but it can't do rabbiting, for example. My main dislike about the homemade jointer is that it's very loud. So let's do a bit of a sound comparison. So I'm going to flick this one and on, and then this one, and you'll get a sense of how much louder it is. So turning this one on. So it's kind of loud, but you can still hear me talk. Now I really have to yell! I'll just turn this one off. So once this one was going, you couldn't even hear the other jointer. It's that loud, and it's because it's based on the guts from one of these small thickness planers, and those thickness planers, they use a universal motor, and those motors unfortunately are always really loud, just like this one. So next we have my homemade Pantorotor machine behind here. So let me just move this out of the way. That's the nice thing about a light homemade jointer is I can wheel it around. And this machine is for Mortising tenon joints, but the funny thing is I haven't actually built any sort of furniture lately, and mostly I've been building little machines and stuff like that. And the Mortising tenon joints are mostly for furniture, so I haven't actually been using this machine very much lately. But it is a very handy machine. I keep in here a lot of accessories in the cabinet, and this sort of roller-on cabinet is also a very cool idea. I built this cabinet actually originally for my slot mortising machine, so it fits both machines, and the machines kind of interlock in here. There's two marbles that are stuck in holes, and when I put the machine on here, it just catches the marbles and locks it in place so it doesn't slide off. So that's actually a very cool idea. I didn't want to have a peg sticking out the top of the cabinet just in case I want to use it for something else, so I can take the marble out and then I can put something else on it. After I built the Pantorotor, well, it is actually a Rotor Pantograph on here. A lot of people asked if that could be used for making letters and carving type of things. So my next creation after the Pantorotor was my Rotor Pantograph, and the cool thing about that machine is it doesn't take up a lot of space. So my Rotor Pantograph is in here. And when I'm not using it, I just pull the pins out of the links, and all the pieces actually fit in here. I don't have a dedicated base for it, so I just always put the parts in the drawer. So this is the main link that mounts the router, for example. And it barely fits in there. It's a fairly compact machine. Sometimes people ask if it can cover things that are 1 meter by 1 meter, and no, it can't, because that would be a gigantic machine. But the machine actually does manage to span this sheet with this whole tray with the follower. So I can put my letter templates in here, and the pantograph, at least the follower link, can actually follow something that large. Of course, any sign that you're going to carve is going to be reduced by a factor of 2, so it'll be this wide. You can scale this machine up a little bit if you multiply all the lengths, but you don't want to scale it by a factor of 2 because it gets too floppy. So I showed off some half-scale copy carving with the pantograph machine, and after that a lot of people asked, how do I set the pantograph to 1:1, because they wanted to copy 1:1 objects. But with a pantograph like that, they can only reduce or enlarge, they cannot do 1:1, so you cannot use the pantograph as a copy carver. But people asked enough about copy carvers that I eventually decided to build one. So here we have my copy carving machine, which I built just recently, and it's based on parallel motion. So we have the router here and the follower here, and it can move side to side, up and down, and it can also tilt, and then we can move back and forth. So this allows some nice copying, and with the tilting capability of the router, you can get at it from different angles, which really improves the flexibility of what you're doing. Now, a copy carver, unfortunately, is always going to be a fairly bulky sort of prospect, because the copy carver has to be at least twice as wide as whatever maximum size object you're going to copy. So if you want to put an object this wide on it, you have to be able to put the original here, the object here, and then you still need room for the rails. So it's going to be a bulky machine. I originally designed this machine to have its own plywood base, but then I realized I don't actually need to have a dedicated plywood base for this machine, because I can just clamp the rails to any sort of workbench or surface. So I just clamped it to my old table saw here and clamped another piece of plywood to mount the stock to. So the whole thing is actually not really that bulky. So to take the whole thing down, I just have to take the router out here. And taking the counterweights out. And now we just have this thing here, which is really not that much bulk. So this is essentially the core of my copy carving machine. And once I've stored that away, all I've got is these two rails and a piece of scrap plywood. So the copy carving machine is really not something that requires a lot of storage space. So it's actually much better than commercial units that way, in that you don't have to dedicate a lot of workshop space to your copy carving machine. So with my copy carver taken off the table saw, I have the table saw back. And the other thing I use this table saw for is to put my rotor lift on the extension wing. I've already got a rotor lift on the right side of my other table saw, so when I designed this tilting rotor lift, I had to put on this one, and that's very handy because it's mobile. And ideally I would have a dedicated rotor table for this tilting rotor lift, but I just don't have the room for it in my workshop. So mounting it on here works just fine. And of course it can be used straight too. So this table saw is on a mobile base, so I can roll it around. And I actually made a video about this mobile base. The cool thing is the saw right now is lifted on the base, and I've got a lever here, and when I put that down, now these wheels are loose and the saw is actually on its legs. So that's the ultimate way of locking the saw in place. So very handy for moving the saw around, although I have to admit most of the time I don't bother locking it, because if I'm just doing light work, it's not like the saw is going to move on me. Behind me, another mobile tool, my bandsaw, and this one is actually just on top of a dolly. This is my first homemade bandsaw, and it's kind of an obsolete machine in some ways because I have a much better design of bandsaw now. But I still use this bandsaw because it's my only 18-inch bandsaw. It's got a really big motor on it, so I never run out of power. So even though I've got better designs, the saw still works just fine. And the fact that it's on a mobile base is very handy, because a lot of times I'll cut something large and I'll hit a wall, so I might be cutting along, hit the wall. I'll take the saw while it's running, move it around just so I can get clearance. So a saw on wheels that moves around can be maybe a little bit unsafe because it can maybe move unexpectedly. But I've so often moved the saw right while it's running because I needed more room, so it's actually kind of a handy feature. People have sometimes also asked me about resaw fence for the bandsaw, about building a special one, but I've actually got a really nice solution. So going way back here, I've got the resaw fence. When I originally made that fence, I made it like this, and then I found that if I stuck it in here, that's a really good spot for it. Only problem is, the next time I wanted to use a resaw fence, all I can remember was that I found a really good spot for it, but I didn't remember what it was. So it was only by chance that I found it again, because when I was looking for it, it just doesn't look like it's a separate part. It looks like it's part of the bandsaw. And this resaw fence can be used in two ways. So if I want to resaw something really tall, I'll put it on here like so. And it's got a bit of a notch here for the blade guide to fit into if I don't need to go quite as high. And then for less tall objects, so if I only want to resaw something that's this high, it's best to have the blade guide closer to the blade. So for less high cuts, I just flip it over, and now I can come down much further with the blade guide. So that's a really handy way to use a resaw fence, and I just attach that to the table with clamps. I don't do that much resawing, and if I do, I don't need to move the fence that much. So that's my resaw fence. I don't think I'll ever build a better one because this one does the job. So back here I've got a machine that I have not been using that much lately. This is my slot mortising machine, and I made a stand for it on top of another machine that I really don't use very much, which is my horizontal boring machine. So I'm using the horizontal boring machine, which is down here, as a stand for my slot mortising machine. So I've got it locked right now, but if I loosen the knobs for the stops, then it can move around. So the slot mortiser is actually a really great machine for cutting mortises. It's better at it than the Panther router is because you don't need a template and it's much quicker to set up. It's also really handy to set up one machine for mortising and the other machine for tanding, so that if you then find you screwed up a part, you can always go back and the machines are still set up. So it makes sense to have both machines, but as I mentioned just before, I haven't been doing a lot of furniture with mortise and tenon joints lately, so I haven't been using this machine very much. And I've got these two boards here which make this whole machine rest on top of the table for my horizontal boring machine, and I have not used that machine very much. The horizontal boring machine is really good for drilling operations where you would set something up with a fence and do repeated operations. But if I need to drill something really accurately, I will just mark it very carefully, center punch the holes, and then the drill will naturally follow the center punch, so that I can actually drill more accurately than the chuck of the drill press. So I haven't really had a need to use the horizontal boring machine very much, and I don't do a lot of series type operations where I need to make 20 parts. So it's never really worth setting up the horizontal boring machine for a job. It's a cool machine, but unfortunately I don't use it very much. So then back here we've got some more machines, so let me just move my table saw out of the way. So as you can see, I don't use these machines very much. Here's my Radial Arm Saw. It's really more of a dust gathering machine at this point. I hardly ever use this machine. I do all the crosscuts with a sled on the table saw, so hardly worth using. I have a miter saw which I almost never use, although I was experimenting with this saw a little bit recently. Somebody was asking me about how to do the miter joints if I want to have something like an octagon, but I want the pieces at an angle. So I worked out the math for that recently, and the saw is still set for that particular joint. So that worked out really nicely, and I should do an article on that at some point, but I haven't got time for it right now. So that's it for the woodworking machines in my workshop. Another very important thing that you don't really see directly in the videos is the lighting. It's really hard to get the lighting just right, and you need a lot of lights. So I have a lot of lamps in my workshop that I can move around, like this one, or these. This is actually a photo light, and here's another one, and I just use these with daylight balanced compact fluorescent bulbs. I really can't use incandescent lights in here because incandescents just create way too much heat and it would just get way too warm in here. So when I'm shooting video, I'll usually have 5 or 6 of these lights actually going at the same time, just to get good even lighting of what I'm shooting. And that's part of the magic for making good videos. It's not how good your camera is, it's how good your lighting is. And that's all I can think of in terms of showing my shop, so I hope you enjoyed this little tour. Maybe I'll make another one in a couple of years' time. That's all.